sharing this remarkably smart essay that has, for me, just articulated very clearly some of the foundational dilemmas of this current moment of crisis. You know, you're asking this question that is on so many minds. You know, who lives and who dies, and you know that's a question we should be asking all the time. But I think the pandemic has really intensified it, and you know, here in the States, we see how the inequalities underpinning contemporary society are just being laid bare, especially in this last week. And you know, so you wrote this essay about a month ago, and you anticipated the coming crisis in Mexico, saying that you know it hasn't quite hit as hard in Mexico yet as elsewhere. And so maybe for starters, if you could just kind of bring us up to date, you know, where is the pandemic in Mexico? Are people starting to make these calculations in emergency rooms? You know, who gets ventilated, who doesn't? Or is there still this attempt to develop, you know, some kind of universal equation that is discriminating on the basis of age, on the basis of pre-existing conditions, that is probably disproportionately impacting queer communities, minority communities that are already struggling with health disparities? So how are things playing out right now?
When we wrote the article, Rosaura Martínez, who is a colleague and a friend of mine, and I, there was a huge debate in Mexico about a guide that was published talking about triage and how they were supposed to pick up people, the ones that were supposed to live and the ones that were not supposed to live, at least in medical terms. And that is why we wrote the article, because the debate was important at that moment. Then what has happened is that they decided that the guide was not effective anymore, because so many people said that it was just wrong, even though the triage exists in the hospitals since ever. I mean, it's not a new thing, but the way in which they did it was extremely clumsy in political terms, but also in moral terms. This is not the way that you should approach to your population, saying that, oh, okay, if you come to the hospital and there is a lack of beds, then we're going to choose these ones. And if you are not in that category, then we're going to let you die, or something like that. But what has happened since is that I think we have not faced that situation yet, and I'm not sure if we are going to face it in the recent moment, because you asked me how is Mexico now, and I really cannot tell, because the situation is complicated, and maybe Francisco can help me with this to describe how is the situation in Mexico. The numbers are getting higher and higher every day. I think that yesterday or the day before we had the largest number of infected people in one day. And even though the situation is like that, the government is saying that they need to open because of the economy and what is happening with the economy, that having things shut for 3 months is just too long. But I think it's not just a concern about economy, it's also a concern about how the people are resisting it, and seeing what is happening in the US with all the riots and the demonstrations. And we see riots in different cities, like in Sweden, for example. Who would think that? So the pressure is huge in the population, and there is being some kind of release of that pressure through the demonstrations and with people on the streets. So I think, in my personal opinion, that what the government is trying to do by opening the economy a little bit is trying to release a bit of that pressure. So we had the president going this very week to the south of the country to inaugurate the construction of a very polemic train in the Riviera Maya for tourism and things like that. And at the same time, here in Mexico City, we see little by little how the city starts to awake again, if it ever was slept or locked down, because here we didn't have a mandatory lockdown as in some places in Europe or in South America, like in Argentina or in Chile, the lockdown is mandatory. But in Mexico, it was, the government was advising us, please stay at home. But it meant that if you couldn't stay at home, well, you go out, or also if you didn't want to stay at home. So at least we had two important things. One is the civil disobedience, that people, I mean, I wonder if people must be disciplined according to what the government says in a certain occasion. If the government tells you, stay at home, why should people obey? Just questioning that, because a lot of people here went out just because. And then the other thing is, of course, poverty and economical and material conditions and educational conditions. Because even though if you didn't need to go outside because you need to work, people just started saying that everything was a lie and a conspiracy and things like that. That has a lot to do with education and the way in which people interpret reality and can be critical against what the government is saying and what are you reading and thinking about it and so on. So in Mexico, at least in Mexico City, the map depends on poverty, where we have more, but it was the same in the States, like in New York and seeing what was happening in Central Queens. It's not only a question of the virus, but about money and who has enough money to pay for the treatment or who needs to go outside and work. So the same happened here, or it's happening here. The neighborhoods with more poverty are the ones that are more hidden, so to speak. And the wealthy ones, are the ones that are safer with less people infected. And it has also happened like that in the rest of the country. Like, I have family in different places living in Mexico, and there the things have been much more relaxed. Like, what is virus? It's like, and people are going out constantly, things are open, the children are playing on the streets, and the numbers are not that high yet. So I think it's a very complicated situation to react in just one way, or to have just one opinion, or to say people must do this or should do this or that. After almost 3 months in lockdown here in Mexico City, I am fed up of this. It's like we are starting to think about it like, well, maybe I can start releasing it a little bit and just facing the consequences of that. Because if this thing is going to be there for at least 1 year or more, what are we going to do? Just stay at home year after year, fearing what? I mean, what is the great fear about all this? About dying, or about infecting another one? Or I don't know, just some questions to discuss with you. Thank you for being here. I'm super happy to have this opportunity to chat with you all. Thank you, Kathy, for making this possible.
And I should say too, today more than ever, please just unmute yourself or send me a message in the chat or the group chat if you want to ask a question. I can only see like a few of the screens, the few faces at a time. I've got at least one more question. One of the things that I thought was a really important insight is that you note that we not only need to care for the mental health of healthcare workers, but also the moral health. So, you know, in the absence of a rule that gives people clear guidelines about who should live and who should die, especially in places like Italy. So Roberta has been living quite near a place where medical workers were forced to make these decisions. You know, we need to think about not only responding to psychological needs, but also sort of the philosophical needs of medical workers who've been making these decisions. And I'd just love to hear more on your thoughts about sort of the moral healthcare work that needs to be done going forward as and I think it's maybe not just the healthcare workers, but it's public officials as well. It's also, I think, in every household where as you're talking about opening up, many of us live with elderly relatives, and the consequences of making the wrong decision, I think, are going to and what gets to count as the right decision and the wrong decision. Like, how to even imagine that. I think we're all making these very personal biopolitical decisions right now, and we need more philosophical guidance. So if you have any words of wisdom, I would love to hear more.
Well, that's a huge question, right? Philosophical guidance for these times. I think philosophy as a moral task, as something that enlightens your spirit, is something that we should do on a regular basis. Studying philosophy, not in professional academic terms, like I wrote 3 papers about Hegel or anything like that, but really taking care of one's spirit, soul, mind, brain, or whatever, and posing the big questions that are outside of the academic world and that are not allowed to be posed in the academic world. For example, the question about life and death, and how do you live your life, and what is a good life, and how do you take care of the others, and how do you take care of yourself? What kind of technologies are you applying on a regular basis to take care of you and the others? And sure, philosophy since the ancient times has been dealing with these kind of questions. And for example, the question about death, how do we deal with it? How do we think and assume our own death and the death of the people that we care of? And I think it's a very personal question that also has to be posed in theoretical terms. And how can philosophy guide there? Many texts have been written in this respect, but Western societies are too afraid of that. I mean, we just cannot deal with that. It's like life were a different thing from death, and we don't want to think about it, and we just don't know how to be with ourselves facing that. For example, everything that has happened with Zoom and the digital world, this kind of transition from the physical, phenomenological life to the digital world, I see it a lot as a kind of evasion, that I don't want to face anything, so then I will keep on working as if nothing had happened, and I will keep on having parties on Zoom. And last day I saw a call to have a race on Zoom. Instead of going there and run on the street, then you do it on Zoom in front of your computer. And it's like, what if we just stop? And I just say it, and it's unthinkable in the contemporary societies to stop. Like, no, I have to keep on working and working and working, even if it has no sense at all. Because if I don't work, if I don't continue moving myself, then I will have to face me, and I will have to think about me. And it's not an easy task. And of course, philosophy is not gonna say to anyone you should do this or that, like how to face it, but just be critical about it, have an open mind, and try to see what happens with it. But yes, this question about the elderly is very tough, because I mean we have elderly people that we are taking care of, and what kind of decisions should we make on their behalf? And there is also another question about elderly and the decision, because they are able to decide by themselves. And sometimes we are taking that possibility from them because we think that they are not being wise enough or smart enough, or that they are not taking care of themselves enough or according to our standards. But many old people that I know, they are just like, I cannot live like this. I cannot live locked down in my apartment. Sorry. So I will just go out and then I shout and scream, you shouldn't do that, you mustn't do that, you have to take care of yourself. And we're telling this to people that is 70 years old, 80 years old, as if they were not grown-ups, or as if they couldn't have rational and logical decisions, or maybe they are just facing death in a different way. Like, if I'm gonna die out of coronavirus, it's fine. I mean, we're, I don't know, running against it with all our forces. And why? And I'm not saying just go there and get infected yourself, but just posing the questions to reflect upon that.
Thank you. That was really insightful. I also have a question going back to something Lisette brought up early on as the pandemic was just emerging. When this group was first emerging, she noticed that in Latin America, there was an asymmetry of responsibility and also vulnerability. Looking at the pattern of spread, it was basically elites, you know, globe-trotting elites that were bringing the virus to Latin America. And so some of the initial infections were, you know, not folks in impoverished situations, but now it sounds like the pattern is shifting. So, you know, if it's an asymmetry of responsibility for the outbreak, it's, you know, the elites that brought it into the country. Is it right? Like, it seems like what your piece is laying out is a similar story to how it's playing out here in the United States with asymmetries of vulnerability.
I don't like that kind of argument because it's about blaming someone. Like, who has the responsibility of this? Like what happened with China, and who has the responsibility of the virus? And of course, the people that went abroad are the ones that first brought the virus to Mexico. And why were they abroad? Because they were traveling, they were doing tourism, they were working, and I don't know. So yeah, sure, people that were, for example, doing winter sports in the States brought the virus to Mexico. And these are wealthy people. So what are we gonna say? Oh, this is the rich people are responsible for infecting the country. I don't think so. I mean, it would happen anyway. It would just take longer if people weren't there skiing in the United States. But as we have seen, it's a question of mobility. So the places that have more mobility are the ones that were hit the most, like New York. If we think about the number of flights going out from JFK, I mean, not now, but before, with so much mobility, well, that is, I think, one of the reasons why the virus spreads so bad in there. While in Mexico City, of course, we don't have that number of flights going to Europe every day. So I think it's a question about mobility and the way in which we have shrunken the world in contemporary days, and that we are moving so fast constantly around the globe. Because, I mean, if this had happened in the beginning of the 20th century, the spread wouldn't be as fast as it is now, just due to vehicles.
Francisco, do you want to jump in here? You've got a question in the chat about the relation between philosophical inquiry and other ways of knowing, living, reflecting, and writing culture, ethnography.
Yes, so very briefly, a few minutes ago, I tried to reorient my screen so that you could see the street that's next to the building where I am at now. And maybe you can go back to the recording of this session and see that the traffic has not really stopped. I am at the edge of Centro Histórico in Mexico City. And so you can see a lot of cars going along the street, but also many people who are actually cleaning the windshields of cars. So right now, that's what you can see from the window where I am at now. So that led me to pose this question, because I was wondering if really considering what's happening in Mexico, at least in Mexico City right now, philosophy is really the only way of addressing the situation, and if maybe we could reflect, since after all this is this group is mostly interested in multispecies ethnography, if we could reflect about the interaction between an ethnographic outlook with the philosophical ways to address the current situation. That was more or less the reason why I was posing this question. So it's more, and my intention is more directed towards trying to see if María Antonia would have something to say about these connections between ways of looking at what's going on, not only with the pandemic, but also with other serious problems that are going on now in our country. And may I add another observation? This has to do with the way you started to pose a question to María Antonia, even in terms of what's happening in Mexico. In my opinion, Mexico is part of a geopolitical region in which maybe the principal actor is the United States. So if you review what's been going on with ways of contagion in Mexico from other countries, in many cases what we can see is that these waves of migration or movement of people in and out of both countries is responsible for most of the especially in the first phase of the epidemic here, the way in which the COVID-19 has arrived in Mexico. So I think it's probably necessary that we reflect about the fact that, at least in this geopolitical region of the world, we're not there are no walls between us. We are very much connected, and that makes well, it's necessary that we reflect about this connectedness more than we often do.
Yeah, thank you, Francisco. I was looking at your window when you changed the computer. You are in Colonia Roma, right?
No, I am on the other side of the street. Colonia Roma starts on the other side.
Okay.
So I'm still in Centro Histórico. So I'm still in the barrio.
So I saw plenty of cars, and I see that is the situation here and there, that many cars are now on the streets. But I want to take my bike, actually, and go through the city to see how things are. But I have not there yet, but I will soon. About your question regarding ethnography, yeah, sure, I absolutely agree with you. Actually, I think that philosophy is not the good discipline to address to these kind of questions, because philosophy needs much more time to reflect. So I was joking with the colleague, with Rosaura, about writing these papers and trying to name them pop-up philosophy, like filosofía de ocasión. We are just reacting to the moment, trying to use what we have learned and our common sense to address the situation in theoretical terms. But to do a real and deep philosophical reflection takes years. I think that most philosophers agree on this, that we need time, and what we are doing is just trying, if we can, to reorient the debate, because at least here in Mexico, the people that are talking about whatever are journalists with very bad background on whatever. So to have academics speaking up their minds to try to put different things on the debate, I think is important, but I don't think that philosophy is a good discipline to address this, and that, of course, the social sciences are the ones that are more able to, because of the tools that they have and the way in which they react to reality and the elements that they have to interpret reality. Therefore, I think that cross-disciplinary perspectives are the ones that are needed in this time, and not just only one discipline. In my personal opinion, I think that philosophy helps a lot as moral philosophy for each individual or for each group to face the situation in a personal level, in terms of anxiety, of fear, of taking care of the others, of what is the meaning of death and life, and all these big questions as I referred before. But in terms of for example, political terms or economical terms, or trying to talk about biopolitics or necropolitics or all this blah, blah, blah that has been there, in my opinion, is kind of a mistake, because it is too soon. Just to see what rock star philosophers are saying about the pandemic, it's like, really? You needed to say that because of an ego question or what? I mean, Zizek just published a book about the pandemic. It's like, and the other question that you posed was about, I don't remember now.
Can I actually follow up with something? Francisco, unless you remember what your question was, the second question.
No, well, it was not a question. It was an observation about the geopolitics of Mexico and the U.S. So I was not really asking anything, but just reminding ourselves of the fact that there is a border, you know, north of where I am, the Rio Grande border. That border is really very porous, and actually, I think we need to question. Maybe sometimes we are too affected by the Trumpian rhetorics about the wall and so on. That's never going to be a reality. No? The interconnectedness between the U.S. and Mexico is only going to be deeper as time passes by. That was just an observation about it.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. This is the border that has more traffic in the whole world. And we know that they are just one city, like Tijuana and San Diego, one in Mexico and the other one in the States, are actually the same city. So, yes, I agree with you.
And not only humans cross the border, huh? Also many non-human agents are crossing the border all the time. I have another observation, but maybe I can get in the line to pose it.
I have a question if there is a scope space for asking that, but it changes the conversation into a slightly different direction. So I wasn't sure, Francisco, if you wanted to continue on that one.
Well, if Sala, if you don't mind, then I will ask I will make this intervention now. So it was about this is more like a question again for María Antonia, following on what she was just reflecting about the philosophy in Mexico. So there was this Festival of Arts and Sciences organized by UNAM, which is a university where both María Antonia and I work. It was supposed to be reflecting about COVID-19. It was called in Spanish, Las Posibilidades de la Vida, the possibilities of life. So there were many interesting events. Judith Butler was one of the main invited speakers. And the closure, the last event of the last talk of the event was Jean-Luc Nancy speaking with Jorge Volpi, who is the chief of the cultural Difusión Cultural office at UNAM. So they were talking about more or less the observations that I think María Antonia was referring to. So the European philosophy view on the issue. So many interesting things were said there, but I was reflecting of the fact that there was no indigenous intellectual invited to the festival, as far as I could see. So there is also the question of how our institutions in Mexico reflect philosophically about what's going on, and if there is actually a diversity of philosophies that are going on in Mexico, and some of them are more oriented towards the metropolitan centers of knowledge production, whereas others are more looking at what's actually going on in terms of theoretical reflection about life elsewhere, outside of the university. So I don't know if you would like to reflect about that diversity of philosophical approaches in Mexico, Maria Antonia. We have talked about this before, so.
Can I actually just add on to Francisco's comment? Sorry, Evan, I didn't mean to.
Sure. Yeah, let's get Lisette's comment, a response from Maria Antonia, and then Sala is also in the stack.
So I'm so happy that Francisco brought up the indigenous question, right? So this, the pluriverse, right, of different concepts of how we respond to COVID, right? And Maria Antonia started off talking about, the frustration with how we're approaching COVID-19, whether or not it makes sense to keep the lockdown going after 3 months, and how you want to live your life if it's the right way to do this, right? So I actually just wanted to pull in another region of the world to think with, and I'm thinking in particular of Arundhati Roy's article on how she was observing what was happening in India, which I actually think might be a better place to think with in relation to Mexico than the United States, right? So in India, there was a very stark contrast to the way that the state responded to COVID than in Mexico, right? So we have AMLO kind of also playing off the virus, in a very similar way, actually, to many state leaders who are playing it down. And then we have Modi, who actually does this, also writes it off at the very beginning and then suddenly does a turnaround and, cuts off everything from one moment to the next, giving people 12 hours to be able to get home from incredibly distant locations, right? And actually probably contaging a lot of places from the city centers going into the rural villages and seeing kind of the horror of those lines and the difficulty in transportation, people walking, et cetera, and all the police abuse, et cetera. So, I want to think with India in that sense, because there is also this question, thinking about the colonial response to COVID, right? So the Western response to COVID, assuming the American way of life where people can retreat into their homes. Obviously, this is not the case for places which are populated much more densely. And like you said, it's not the same in Queens or in Crown Heights as it is in suburban New Jersey, right? There's differences, obviously, there's asymmetries. But then thinking about, whether or not there's another way of responding to COVID, I think that's a really legitimate non-Western approach to COVID-19 when you have economies that are so dependent on day laborers, on informal workers, et cetera. But at the same time, I know that this, Evan, the only reason I wanted to jump in was because you started off with something that I mentioned to prior visit. And I actually think that week, it was the week that we were talking about AIDS, and the place that I was coming from was actually from a Latin American trans scholar, Pedro Lemebel, who talks about the infection of Chile in particular in AIDS coming from the north, right? So thinking about the colonial implications of the disease's migration, right? So it's not so much a blame game as in let's blame, whoever patient zero is, but thinking about, again, those asymmetries and those colonial inflections in the way that those asymmetries play out and those inequalities play out. And, in particular in Chile, the anger was that the upper class was not respecting the virus's reach, and that the way that it was spreading in Chile in particular was from Las Condes, which is the upper class neighborhood, to the areas where people cannot socially distance, right? Where it's impossible to socially distance in a house that is not so far away from the next house where you have 6 people living inside of the same house, right? So again, thinking about those inequalities and how they affect. But in particular, in relation to Mexico and its border, going back to Francisco's comment also about the geopolitical, right? The porosity of the border. Thinking also about, the current politics for the border from the United States and also from Mexico, which are deporting, migrants And
Yes,
in
of
particular,
course.
places like Guatemala, like Ecuador, like Honduras, all of Central America, where they are deporting the virus into those places, right? I mean, where there is like a blatant disregard for how that's going to affect these places that have much less of an ability to deal with, you know, what's going to happen. Yeah, it might always have happened. It's going to spread. We're in the 21st century, you know, there's a difference in the way that we move, but there are also ways in which this is moving much quicker, and it's based on particular types of decisions and particular types of actors that are making those influences happen, right? So that's all I wanted to say.
Maria Antonia, do you want to respond?
Well, so complicated to respond. First thing that Francisco said regarding this festival at UNAM, I didn't follow it. I haven't watched anything about it, but because as I said before, I don't understand this urge to go into digital. The Festival of Art and Science was planned to happen physically, and they moved it to happen digitally, having performances, artworks, conferences, and things like that online. And I'm just fed up. I cannot follow everything that is happening in the world online. I'm being stuck 10 hours a day watching my screen. So for me, it is enough. I know that Judith Butler spoke there because also Rosaura Martínez is the one that replied to her lecture or to her talk. So if you want to see it, I think it's in English and it should be online. And that Jean-Luc Nancy also spoke there, but I haven't seen it at all. There is an effort on the side of UNAM to continue producing cultural stuff through the pandemic, and the museums have migrated to the digital form. And although I respect the effort, I'm not sure in a critical way if this is the way that we should answer to the pandemic or just to stop. But yeah, then of course, many other questions arise regarding that. Then about the indigenous people and the way in which the academia is dealing with that issue, I have no commentary because I don't know. I know how difficult the topic is for our university because it's a very white university, or as we call it, white-sican, like Mexican white-sican, where people with power come from certain families and that's it. And it's very difficult to break through. So the indigenous are not included mainly in the university, and most of all they are not included in the important places. And some researchers, as we know, have done marvelous research on the topic, like Leon Portilla and others. But in ethnographical, philosophical terms, and that's it. And for the mainstream academia, the topic is still very distant, I would say. Even if with post-colonialism, it is appearing more and more. Sometimes I see that the issue about post-colonialism is addressing different topics regarding, for example, Africa, or regarding the relationship with Spain, but we have a lot to do there yet and to think about it. But I don't know. I mean, it's not my field, and I unfortunately don't know enough about that. Then about what Lisette said regarding decisions and actors, sure, I mean, if we are facing a virus and the virus is affecting the humans, then we are not facing a biological issue, but a complex issue that has to do with politics, with culture, with economy, and so on. So it's never going to be just the virus spreading and infecting people, but all the things that are related to it, starting with the political decisions that the governments are taking that could be super wrong, as what we saw in India, what happened in India as a catastrophe, or what is happening in Argentina, for example, that the government has reacted in a very strict way and the population is fine and they are supplying people with food. And I think the reaction from the Argentinian government is exemplar in this way. And sure, so we should think about decisions and actors also. And then Roberta asked in the chat about triage applied to the whole society. And I also agree with that. What has been said a lot here and there is that the pandemic has been kind of a magnifying lens of the inequalities around the world and in the specific societies. And the triage has always been there. For example, in Mexico, we have a very bad situation in terms of the health system because it has been kind of abandoned for many years now. So normally people don't have enough resources to get a good medical attention. So it's not new. Now it's just worse, but it was there before, the inequality regarding the health system. And same everywhere, unless you have a universal health system, as in some places in Europe or in Canada, the thing is people with money against people without money. But then also it's not also a question inside the societies, but in global terms, like the countries that have more money are of course applying violence against the countries that have less money. And we saw this competition to get the ventilators and the medicines and so on, so among different countries, and the ones with more money that were buying things at more expensive prices and so on. So what is the question here? There I think that rules should apply and that we should as society commit to rules that we could agree on before. But then we see what happens when we have China and the States fighting and then the rules just don't apply. So I don't know.
So Sala, you've been patiently waiting with a question.
And this is maybe a really good time because my question was exactly about the triage. And so I really enjoyed the conversation all throughout. But triage in as a division that medical ethicists working in hospitals and medical professionals working in hospitals in normal circumstances and in different kinds of crises, it's something that they've had to do all the time. But and as you rightly pointed, that what is exceptional about the circumstance is the kind of the flurry of people coming in need at this particular time. And so in your piece, I was left wondering that you take a strong position saying that triage is immoral and there's no philosophical ground or justification for institutionalizing triage. But it left me then wondering, if you don't have a triage, does it then just mean that the kind of unequal logic that lots of places have, as we've already established, that will just take its course and the rich will get the access and those who don't have funds don't? Or is there an alternative moral philosophy or theory that you would propose that would ensure that the kind of inequalities just don't fall into the way in which the resources are allocated? So if you think triage is immoral, then what would be the alternative theory to ensure that everybody gets access? And you, in a way, I think already answered this question, but I would really like to hear you talk more to it.
Thank you, Sala. What we were trying to state is not that triage is not going to happen eventually in the hospitals if they run out of beds, but that it is immoral to try to justify it in philosophical terms. You have to apply certain practical rules to do it, but you cannot justify it because there is enough. There is enough in the world. I mean, there are enough resources to save people. there is enough food in the world to feed people. So it's a question about sharing it. So philosophically, I don't think that we should come with some strong argument to say that this is right. Quite the contrary. If triage is being applied with practical rules, or if the medical staff is applying it, I mean, not only now, but under certain conditions, philosophically, we must say it is immoral, because we cannot justify any decision about who dies and who lives when it is in terms of having the resources. That is what we wanted to state in the paper or the article.
On that note,
but it doesn't still resolve, like, well, if once you have that situation that where people, where, you know, resources are short, how do you ensure that everybody does get access? Like, do you have a moral philosophy, a theory, how you ensure which moral principle applying would you then propose a more like a social justice basis, for example, as to ensure that everybody gets healthcare?
I might jump in and tag a comment on, there's a really important line in the article where you're talking about a corrective moral project where all lives and deaths will have dignity. So, I mean, it in a sense, it sort of answers Salah's question. And I'd love to just hear more about that corrective moral project that you envision.
I didn't hear anything that you say. I don't know if it is my internet.
So I was just drawing everyone's attention to the line in your essay where you're talking about the corrective moral project, where all human lives will have dignity, lives and deaths, and I was just wanting to hear more about that.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I insist on the point. I don't think that philosophy can justify it, that there are no arguments to justify this. I think some other disciplines, like the ethical committees with the medical staff, have rules and not solutions, but have rules to implement these things. But in philosophical terms, I think that we must resist it, and we must resist the temptation of trying to have logical and reasonable arguments for this. Quite the contrary, we should be criticizing this constantly, saying there, even if there are practical rules, it's not the way that we should go. And if they are going to do it, they are going to do it. But let's not legitimize it with rational arguments, saying that, well, it has to be done, because we shouldn't be doing this, since there are enough resources in the world, because there are. That was the main point in. And also regarding to the lives and deaths that should be dignified, all of them. And we have seen with this a lot of discrimination in many respects of certain kinds of population, like people of certain age, but also people that are already sick, or people that have bad nutrition, so they have diabetes, for example, or high blood pressure, and these things are also because of poverty sometimes. So saying that you don't deserve medical treatment because you have diabetes and it's less probable that you will survive coronavirus is just immoral.
So technically we're at 1 o'clock, so some people might have to go, but there's some really lively discussion on the chat if people would like to ask those questions. So Kathy and Roberta have been having some interesting discussions about the idiom of triage and warfare. Rachel has also put a question in there about transmissibility and resource sharing. So if anyone wants to jump in, feel free to ask.
Okay, should I go first?
Yes.
Okay.
Go.
So but this is like my dilemma. I had read Antonia's article some time ago when it came out. And I've been since very much taken by this idea of triage. And I've been kind of looking at the way in which we actually apply triage in other circumstances, not necessarily in the health, to the health system, and especially in this neoliberal and necropolitical system that we are in, where basically the most vulnerable groups are made to do triage among each other. So they are basically fighting for the same little slice, and they end up not being in solidarity with each other, but they end up actually fighting each other for something that is very small. This is triage culture. This is not just like being in a situation of inequality. And this is the system that has basically made us, that has forced us to behave this way, because we've been taught since the beginning that there's only that much that we have, and the resources are scarce, etc., etc. So I'm very happy that Maria Antonia has mentioned this, that there is something for everybody. It's just that like it's the system itself that doesn't allow us to think in these terms. So this was my idea, and I've been struggling with it, because I'm like, well, these groups are actually getting, or even in petty discussions, and they're not going anywhere, and they are like getting lost into these conflicts, and they're not being in solidarity with each other. But that's because there's desperation behind it, and there's this idea that there's not enough for everybody. But then I was also very interested in what Kathy had to say about where the triage comes etymologically, and it's just fascinating. That's why I find it so violent to start with. So it was more of a
maybe
comment.
we'll collect questions.
Yeah, no, I'll just,
Thank you.
I really appreciate what Roberta was saying, and I had just fed into that a little bit with the concerns I was having in terms of the relationship of triage. For me, when I think of that term, I think immediately of wartime and this kind of crisis moment, which has, you know, kind of warlike implications. And now we're also seeing in the US with the protests that are happening, this war type language used not to support and protect the people who are protesting, but to support property, to support, you know, the president himself, so he can have a photo op, you know, all of these kinds of things, which are really, and the police themselves. So it's really problematic in terms of the use of the language for me. But I like Roberta's idea because it was so much broader. So it was a little thought.
What do you think?
Nothing.
Maria Antonia.
Oh, Maria Antonia.
Yeah, thank you both. You made me think about some difficult question, Roberta, with this idea of triage and having enough and so on. So that before the pandemic, we were talking about climate change and about gender violence and about the Anthropocene and so on. So, and all of a sudden, when human lives are at risk, all those topics just disappear. And this, we have enough, but at the same time, how many thousands of millions are we in the world? And of course, it is difficult to address the situation of, is there enough food thanks to the technological agricultural revolution? Is there enough medicine thanks to the science and technological revolution and so on? So that, let me frame this, or try to frame this argument like this. We are in a logic, a world vision, where control and domination of nature has been the most important thing for the last centuries. And we have built the idea of the world that we live in with these control and domination topics at the center. And we have been criticizing this very heavily for the past decades or even for the past century, that instead of thinking about nature as something that is there to control according to our own desires, something that we should respect and listen, and a lot has been said about it. But in the moment that we see an infection like this threatening human lives around the globe, all that different position regarding nature is all of a sudden obliterated, and we are just thinking about more control and more domination and more technology and more medicine and more hospitals, and to save as many human lives as possible. So it's like it has put the Anthropocene logic in the center of what we are doing, and also we are thinking about ourselves as action subjects. And that is also the ontology that this world is built from. We are action subjects that have the world as an effect of our actions. And this is the way that we are reacting, because in the midst of an emergency, we are not going to think about alternative ontologies. We will use the ontology that is the most effective in terms of transforming the world. And that is I can never say this word, hegemonico. Will you help me, Lisette, with that, please?
Hegemonic.
Too easy. It's hegemonic.
That ontology. So, and also it's very complicated to bring the issue forward, because what is then the alternative, right? But we have been running with a lot of anxiety, claiming for more science to control the virus, claiming for more technology, claiming for more medicine, because what we need is to save human lives, because it's the human and the human and the human. And I'm not saying, oh, this is wrong. I'm just trying to reflect upon it.
So thank you for bringing us back to the multi-species realm, which is, you know, one of the core concerns of this group. Rachel, you had a question, and then Elaine has also expressed an interest in asking a question.
Thank you. It's such a wonderful conversation. Thanks again, María Antonia. I guess the thing that was on my mind most as you were talking about the necessity of sharing was just transmissibility factors. And I've been thinking a lot about mutualism, the concept of mutualism in my own writing. And I guess, I mean, the thing that sticks out to me, and maybe this is just because I grew up with a bunch of community organizers and punks who talk about this regularly, but I mean, this seems to me that this moment in particular begs the question of the absolute necessity to move forward with sharing. It seems to me that we are confronted with, as you say, our hegemonic realities, and at the same time the profound implications of not in I don't want to use the word investing, but not growing roots with ideas about sharing. And the thing that is most prominent in my mind on this front is certainly the question of transmissibility. This is a highly transmissible virus. This is something that is, moving so swiftly in a variety of different directions and across species and across borders, as we've all sort of suggested and talked about consistently in the group. But transmissibility just in terms of time, that this is, we're in a quick time moment in which, 2 days and you see, further numbers ballooning, 3 days and you see, triple numbers. And so it seems to me that, thinking about resource sharing is profoundly, it's profoundly important and absolutely necessary if we're talking about the ethics of how to grapple with global pandemic. I feel like I don't see any other way, because if you think about you know, the lack of solidarity that has occurred thus far, and then the sort of hoarding of resources, highly expensive resources, profoundly expensive resources that we may not even own. You know, we don't have the potential for DIY options for yet. You know, ventilators and things like that. Sharing and mutualism seem to be the true, to me, the only way that we can move forward. And so I really appreciate what you've outlined for us, and how you're helping us go more in depth with this. So thank you.
Do you want to respond, Maria Antonia, or should we get Elaine's question and then let you respond?
Well, just a quick response, because sharing is, I was thinking about ethics or politics. If we talk about a small community, you would share the resources that you have hoarded. I mean, for example, with your family, your friends, if anybody is lacking something, I think that most of us would share their own resources, because ethics is something that you can apply to a community that is more or less reachable and knowable. But when you think about global terms, this idea of ethics is much more complicated. So maybe their politics should apply. And I will go back again to the question about rules. We should have international rules to try to deal with this kind of problems, and not believing in the good faith of governments. But again, how to have rules that are going to be mandatory for every country? We see that this is never going to happen, because it's a question of strength and interests and so on. And are governments something that behave according to ethics? I don't know, complicated. But also at the same time, with this globalization of everything, it's so difficult for an individual to think in ethical terms regarding the whole planet. I mean, it is rough enough to think ethically regarding myself and my community, my surrounding community. And if I think that I'm responsible for my actions in respect of the whole world, it's just too much. It's like Lisette was saying something about religion and Catholicism, and so it's like God is watching you constantly, what you are doing, how are you behaving, because you are responsible for your actions forever and ever. And now it's not that you're responsible because God is watching at you, but because there are future generations and there is the whole globe that you have to take care for. So complicated issues, of course. No, thank you for the question. And just
thank you for that brilliant response.
To what Lisette was saying about faiths in different cultures, I also think that in general Latin American people have a different way to react to these kind of things. We see a lot of, how would I call this, festivity on the streets, that people are not completely afraid, like I don't want to touch anybody, but you see people dancing on the street and sharing food and sharing drinks. It's like, I don't know, a different way to react or to see reality.
Thank you. Elaine, do you want to ask your question, and then I think we'll wrap up?
Sure. I've been, the discussions have been so fruitful and just so mind-blowing. I was looking at the whole issue that you brought up of triage in a larger conceptual way, and what you were just talking about was just a perfect lead-in around this consciousness and these ethics that we choose to have as humans. And feeling it so complicated that we're looking after each other, but we're also looking after the world at the same time. As an environmentalist, that's the consciousness I and everyone else who works as environmentalists are always looking for people to have that broader way of approaching world and nature. But what I was wondering philosophically and morally was, are people every individual that now walks out the door committing triage are making a choice of whether they're going to infect somebody or not infect somebody, whether they wear a mask or don't wear a mask. And I, as an immune compromised person who's just been through cancer treatments, am walking out the door with suspect constantly of how do I stay safe. So your things you brought up earlier around the safety of the self, the time to stop, the time to make decisions, how the elderly, those disadvantaged are being affected by all of this. But with triage, with us thinking about that we are consciously or unconsciously performing triage every time someone walks out the door, because we are coming into contact either with nature and we're making choices as individuals around products we buy, or whether we put toxins into the earth, et cetera, larger scale or smaller scale. I have a feeling this is all overlapping in many, many ways right now. I know it's a very large question, but I'm wondering if you have an idea of how to think about that.
I don't know. I think it is crazy that we have the responsibility, of course, towards the other. But at the same time, if we go by thinking about this in a very, I don't know, very anxious, neurotic way, like my saliva can infect anyone, and then how am I supposed to live like that? Of course, it can infect anyone if I have the virus, but then how? And I'm always thinking now about this related to HIV and AIDS and the way in which we learn to discipline our bodies, and how everything changed after that, because there is no cure, there is no vaccine for HIV, and the discipline of the bodies is there, and we are responsible for the health of the other person all the time. And there are people that care, and we know that there are people that just don't care. But the discipline of the bodies here is much more complicated. So what are we gonna do with our own bodies? See them as the cause and agent of someone else's possible death? If we start thinking about ourselves in that way, I don't know, it's just, I go and visit my mother every week, and I think of myself as a potential agent of her possible death if I infect her. And what am I supposed to do? Just, I don't have an answer for that, because the fear is there and it's so vivid still. But at the same time, we should use some reason to try to cope with this, and to try to face the possibilities of losing the other one, or of dying out of the virus in such a horrific way, because what scares me the most is the way in which people die out of coronavirus, because you die alone there at a hospital and nobody is nearby, and the people that you know are only communicated the news. And I think this is really, really horrible. So again, right, too many questions, but it's just to reflect upon them instead of trying to answer them. And yes, I will continue thinking about my body and what does my body mean as a disciplined thing and as an agent of infection. And at the same time, trying to think in a healthier way that I cannot be afraid of my fluids, my saliva, all the time, constantly thinking about it in a neurosis. Thank you.
Thank you. That was such a brilliant thought to leave the discussion on. I really enjoyed the conversation today, and hope to read more and think with you in the future. I also wanted to say a little bit more about the event that we're having on Sunday, the same time slot, same Zoom channel. So we are having a discussion with a key member of the coronavirus study group. So this is a group of virologists that have been studying coronaviruses for decades, and in fact have given the current coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2, its official name. So this is a really rare opportunity to ask someone who actually knows something about coronavirus. There's a lot of kind of self-made experts in this pandemic who've been opining about the issues of the day. But here's someone who has a deep and abiding interest and curiosity about the natural history of this organism, not only the pathogenic strains of coronavirus that are causing health problems for people as well as livestock, but the broader questions of ecology and natural history. So I think Sunday is an opportunity for us to ask, some of the basic questions that many of us have about virology, about this particular virus, but also sort of get through some of the ontological and epistemological haze that is surrounding this pandemic, and think and speak with somebody who's quite knowledgeable. Thanks again to Maria Antonia. Thank you to Lisette for being on the line and helping facilitate the conversation. And thanks again to Kathy for posting this amazing article on Facebook and connecting all the dots and letting this conversation happen today. So really good to see you. Hope to see some of you on Sunday. Okay.
See you soon.
Ciao.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you all.
See you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye
Evan.
now.